Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. And thank you to our three artists and our wonderful curator, who's our moderator. Today, we're presenting a special topic for me, and I think many of us in this room, exploring how a dual cultural upbringing manifests in an artist's body of work, growing up between two cultures. Today we have Kha, Diana Markosian, and Keisha Scarville presenting on their work with curator Jene Strand. Enjoy.
Thank you all for being here, and thanks to the photo show for having us. I'm so excited for this conversation and excited to get into each of these wonderful artists' practices, but also how their backgrounds, how their place of origin, how their place of being shows up in the imagery that they'll walk us through. So we'll have a presentation from each of the artists on their practices, just to level set the knowledge in the room, ensure that we have imagery attached to the words that we'll be conversing and expressing to you all. And then we'll get into a more organic and informal conversation and then take questions from the audience afterward. So we'll start with Tommy on their practice.
Oh, wow. Yay. I'm gonna start that. Oh, yay, okay, cool. I know what I'm doing. Hi, everyone. I'm going to present a few quick slides. Oh, yeah, okay, so they can see that. Oh, yeah, I was like, yay. I am showing mostly the collaboration between my mom and I back in Memphis, where my mom and my family relocated. I like the idea of the domestic space as a possibility of stage and conflicting narratives, as much as thinking about the topic of family archive or first generation experience and what that means between parent and child, and how much does that account for the immigrant experience, if that is, of those traces of those experiences are with the first generation. I put in a few other things that feel that is more thematic, but also highlights my practice. I do a lot of in-camera props and tricks, everything in camera, and often working with a cutout of my image and just thinking about the thing that's out of place is my body within the space and landscape. I picked this water imagery. It was shot at Marsha P. Johnson, a queer figure, but also linking the both their drowning and my uncle's drowning when he died crossing the border. My mom's photographs I want to show just because I think that's important to tie in her experience, because I don't think that story is necessarily mine to tell, but I think her influence is a really like a Louise Bourgeois, this kind of mother Genesis creative narrator, spider weaver. And so I always like to show this image because of her reading the pattern drafting book for sewing. And just this weird, odd picture that she gifted me this album about 6 years into us photographing together, and she just revealed that she also made pictures briefly in the 1980s. And so I like thinking about the involvement of my family into my work, where they're kind of have a different relationship to photography because I'm more educated and very educated in the West, and having not the same experience as my mom, who thinks of photography as a documentation, a record, a thing that just does that, and really doesn't think of it outside of its other uses as art or traces of survival. So I think it's important that to point out the family album or the pictures I have are really fragmented. So it does make sense to work in a medium that deals in fragmentation of photography, to think about my family's influence, whether I wasn't really conscious about it, but I think of Edward Said, of other echoes in the garden, and how much the past continues to haunt us in our present. And so I like to think of these are as clues to our survival, the things that are really inside, those individual experiences that aren't accounted for in history. And so I think it stands to so much reason to use the personal as not just a subject matter, but as the material, because it's not on the internet, so we have to source it ourselves. And I don't know anything before 1930s in my family's history, so I think this is the last one. Oh, and then I'm just like recently working, it's hard to see, but it is trying to work with my family's archive recently in different forms of photography that isn't necessarily a print on the wall. This is like a bubblegram with a black and white picture inside a crystal block made out of laser etching. But yeah, hi.
Thank you. I'm Diana. I was born in the former Soviet Union, and I grew up in 2 different cultures, and then 3 eventually, but I was born in Moscow to Armenian parents, and my family's from Armenia, and overnight we came to America and left behind my father and a culture and a life. So when I was starting photography, there was this real yearning to go back, to understand where I came from, to understand my history and both of my parents. And photography in a way became a tool to not only remember, but to recreate and to, in a way, reclaim a culture. And so much of my work has been about my own family's story, but also embedding in different cultures in the former Soviet Union as a way of understanding where I came from, as a way of exploring my own interests, and just really having more nuance as an artist. This body of work was about my mother, and it was about learning at 27, 20 years after we came to America, that my mom was a mail order bride, and she married an older man who became my dad, and my own father was left behind in Moscow. So I worked, when creating this body of work, I worked with actors, a screenwriter, and and tried to recreate certain memories and really understand her. And then at another point, I went and found my real dad. And I traveled back to Russia to search for him, knocked on doors, and he wasn't there, and then eventually found him in Armenia. So those are my 2 first books, about my dad and my mom, and then our relationship in between. And then another body of work that really focused on my own heritage was a project called 1915, where 100 years after the genocide, the Armenian genocide, I was living in Turkey and created a project where I photographed memories from survivors who are living in Armenia, and then I brought it back to them in form of a life-size landscape for them to interact with. So 100 years later, they're standing and being confronted with the memory of their home. And this project, in a way, allowed me to find myself in this story. My grandparents on both sides were descendants of the genocide and escaped it, landed in Armenia. And in a way, it was like meeting my own grandparents and allowing them to have their memories.
Hello? Clicker. Okay, there we go. Hi, everybody. My name's Keisha Scarville, and in thinking about, how do I do it? Oh, sorry. In thinking about, like, how does being first generation inform my practice? I was born here. My parents are from Guyana, South America. They immigrated to the United States in the late 1960s. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about that has come up for me a lot is thinking about like being first generation as this kind of hyphenated space. And all of these prefixes, that kind of lead us into being American. And so there's something for me, I think about in terms of photography and the way in which I approach photography is thinking about like that hyphenated space as kind of this way to kind of amplify and underline these, these different registers of identifying one's being. And so for me, not necessarily feeling quite American, but not necessarily feeling quite Guyanese, there's something of that that kind of leads into this feeling of kind of being in between. And so there's a liminality that I think that I'm also attracted to in terms of capturing. I'm always thinking about like what's at the kind of edge of visibility. And there's not a lot of imagery, like, I think I have an image of my grandmother, but there's not a whole lot of imagery, and how do you go back? This one? Forget it. There's not a whole lot of imagery, beyond my grandmother. So there's, I think I've been attracted to photography because it kind of is this kind of counteract against these like visual absences in terms of my own history. So this image is actually taken, so I'm often photographing between here and Guyana. This is a image I took in response or kind of part of a project about my mother who passed away. And in an interesting way, like sometimes when I'm thinking about America, there is this kind of narrative of death that comes up for me. And for me to be able to do this project about my mom, I had to travel back to Guyana. So I'm thinking about that, and I'm also thinking about trying to understand the place and individuals that my family, that my parents left. So for me, going back, I'm highly invested in the kind of constant return because it is part of my lineage, and I do want to understand how this is, like how these factors of being and space and family kind of occupy space. And so I think also there's something of, the first generation that has kind of evoked for me, especially in doing my book, like thinking about the remix. And there is something of that, that space of being a first generation American, that there is this kind of remix. There is this kind of space where it's being this kind of hyphenated space is not necessarily this void, but it's this space that's kind of so full of like all of these different histories and narratives. And so thinking about like the legacy of hip hop and the legacy of hip hop on my personal history in America, and how that kind of also integrates imagery of my grandmother in Guyana. And currently I have a show up at Higher Pictures, this project that I've been doing for the past 10 years about my father's first passport photo. And it's like the one place where I feel like I'm having the most direct conversation about what it means to be American, and more specifically, thinking about my father's experiences coming here, but also thinking about like what are those implications, and how is my dad's thinking about this landscape different or similar to mine, and what are those implications that that have impacted me on being here. That's all I got.
Thank you each for your introductions into your practices. And I would love to start with a question on the objects that we're witnessing in your works. I'm thinking about, Diana, in your work, the ways that interior, the ways that the decadence of some of those images through wallpaper or through a chair says as much about the person living in the space as it does the space itself. Tommy, for you, I'm thinking about the pattern drafting book that says so much about what your mom was thinking about at that time, how she cared to spend her days, and the ways that objects come forth as an indication of personhood as much as autobiography does. And Keisha, for you, I'm thinking about the Guyanese gold, of course, you know, thinking about that overlap between hip hop and America, but how Guyana was able to produce a sense of identity through jewelry, and we see that in some of your images. Can you each talk about how object comes forth for you in the making of the image and the objects that you sort of gravitate towards as you're thinking about the arcs of the stories that you're creating?
I think for me, this idea of going back, I wrote a lot about this feeling of walking into a museum of my childhood and how these artifacts almost felt like proof that the past really did exist. It wasn't just a memory, it wasn't just a feeling. You know, this culture did belong to me. And how do you reclaim it, and how do you feel not like an imposter or a wannabe, or just how do you feel at home in it after being away for so long? And I think for me, the objects in the home felt so familiar, and it's, you know, you kind of want to take it all with you because it just feels so different than anything you have here. And I remember even when we first came to America, the home, my stepfather's home, was so white and bright, and unlike this little tiny home that we had in Moscow, which, you know, one bed for four of us. I mean, we had such a small space, but America had such a lush, you know, interior, exterior. The light in California is so bright. So I think objects to me feel very much a part of not only memory, but also of a culture, right?
Oh man, I'm thinking of the wording of it, of really going back to photography and the photograph as an object itself. I think is where it goes back to the fragmentation of it, the quality of photography, cropping, cutting things away outside the camera, the limitation of the frame. And the objects that I just go back to the idea of fragmentation, the idea of cutting, the idea of that with what my mom is reading as a pattern drafting. And those pictures don't have negatives. So the photographic print becomes just as important because that is the trace of it. And I think the photograph as an object is this kind of evidence. I always say this, but it feels so weird for me to keep repeating it, but the idea that photography is this visual language. It is language itself, that it is a communal activity that needs more than one person for it to evolve. And so I think that itself is the importance of finding these objects. So for pattern drafting, it is this metaphor of weaving or sewing or patchwork, or that fragmentation, which I think is now translating as collage to me, another kind of fragmented medium, and it being just really fun for me to use photography as a way to preserve this kind of thing of the past. This, and I don't know, just to point out, this is like terrible how my family just used my pictures for that funeral. It's like really like just all like weirdly the different ideas on how to use those portraits of my grandmother. But yeah.
Am I supposed to use this? Hello? Well, I mean, I think like as I'm listening to you, Diana, and to Tommy, but also thinking about objects in my photographs, but also objects that I grew up with, like I can't help but think about the ways in which objects are political as well. Like like when it comes to like Guyanese gold, which is something that is like really highly desirable, but it also kind of like your ability to access it, to wear it, to flaunt it, it does, there's something behind that, but also the ways in which it's being mined, the ways in which it's being accessed, like the way in which we have to pull that out and how that's affecting the landscape and ecology of Guyana. So there are these things and there's something that I'm just kind of always thinking about when it comes to like how I'm working with those passport images in particular. But I remember one of the very first objects, growing up, one of the very first objects that that kind of became like the landscape of my home, of our apartment, was we had this huge photograph of Marcus Garvey on our wall. And I had no idea who Marcus Garvey was. And I've said this a lot where I literally thought he was a family member until someone told me different. And so, we had like there was like Black Fists. And so my dad and my mom, they were, ardent like Pan-Africanists. And so there were these things that I was kind of learning by way of like the objects that were in my home. But, when I go to Guyana, like one of the things that I often see are, trophies that represent like these things, like different members of my family who've done well in school. So there's all of, I'm saying all this to say that, the ways in which like I was kind of learning about who my family was and the thinking and ideologies that were informed by their journey or their path, but also how objects become these kind of placeholders of accomplishment, and that having a little bit of a political aspect to it as well.
Mm-hmm. And to lean into the thought on ecology, I'm specifically thinking about what you mentioned of the work, but also your emotional affect to the work being on the precipice of visibility. And so can you talk about how, for each of you, landscape and ecology, I feel like shows up especially in your practice, Diana, and in your work as well, Keisha. And Tommy, I think you look more toward the home and the interior as a space of a different kind of ecology and a different kind of production and continuation of a thing. Yeah. So can you talk about, for each of you, how landscape and ecology is not only a scene in which a photograph is taken, but it's also a site for either concealment, remembrance, or anchoring for another idea?
I think, for me, in terms of, I just think about the idea of even going back, and finding my home, and not even in terms of a country, but let's say my father. The landscape and the place is now tied only and specifically to him. Like that is, Armenia to me is my dad, my father. And so for me, I think I see it in a more emotional way. Same with, like, let's say 1915 is a great example of how that project was all about creating landscapes to bring back to the people. These were their memories. These were the last things that they were, the last almost idea of home that they had before having to flee. And they gave me all these little clues on how to find their homes or the place that they remembered. And I went back, photographed that landscape, and brought it back to them as a way of interacting with their home. So for me, I think I don't know if this is what you're hoping or what you're asking, but like for me, it's so emotionally and like connected to the people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, I keep thinking of Keisha, you brought up hyphen, and like I think of so many different definitions that we were all trying to discuss what it means to be first generation, and I come back to the idea of the landscape, especially being born in Memphis, Tennessee, being born in the South, of the idea of being called a suburban photographer is like, what space do I really honor and view? Which has mostly dealt with immigrant experience where people who leave countries willingly are expats, but people who are fleeing war or not going or leaving on their own free will become immigrants or refugees. So it is, I think, a confirmation in a way of these landscapes to be more like palimpsest is the word I've been using, the idea that these layers that get erased, painted over with new information, and then for that cycle to start again is so much like our bodies. It's so much like the landscape that's not just the South, but in every space that we inhabit. And I think that is maybe the expression of the hyphen or trying to define it in such a way, but then we also have to grapple with the concerns of the previous generation too, and what do we lose and compromise and negotiate for our own identities? Which backgrounds do we keep? And yeah.
I mean, and I'm gonna get to the question, but I mean, I'm even also thinking about like that, even that, like thinking about like what is lost or what is erased or what is painted over. And I think for me, I think so much of it is like trying to kind of, like, is it possible to hold all of it? Like, is it possible? Like, does anything have to, for me as a first generation, like, how do you hold all of it without losing? And like, so I feel like I'm kind of also holding on to those things that perhaps my parents wanted to kind of discard. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
there's something, so I think for me sometimes when I think about being first generation, I don't know if I'm personally, like, I don't know if I'm engaging in this, like, what do I hold on to? What do I lose? And I think that that's probably maybe a choice that my parents had to make. But for me, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to hold all of it. How do I hold all of it?
Yeah.
And how do I retrieve, like, you know, how much can I retrieve as well? So that's something I'm thinking about. Even when it comes to thinking about landscape, and thinking about, like, for me, like, the landscape is this kind of vast space that holds so much history and so much time. So every time, like, when I'm here and photographing and when I'm there photographing, I don't know, there's like something I'm like incredibly conscious and aware of, you know, what is the length of time that I've been here? And also now, what is the length of time that people before me or part of my lineage has been here? And so that's something I'm thinking about in relationship to landscape.
I think when you also lose, you know, a culture, and we immigrated, and I didn't go back for 20 years, you don't really take it for granted when you do go back. It just feels very sacred to be in a position to go back. Like, we came and my mom really encouraged us. It was very black and white. We needed to be Americans and speak English. And, you know, there wasn't really nuance at home. It was, we're American and our culture is behind us. So when I think I became an artist and really wanted to go back, you know, it was a big shock for her as to, you know, how I did everything to save you. You know, why are we going back? You know, this fear of even having this duality, you know, it's almost like there was no space for it in my upbringing.
All of that makes me think about the ways that value shifts as generations shift also. in what each of you are saying, I'm thinking about how the familial archive now has a different value in how you all are referencing it, approaching it, and using it as source material for your work. But also, Diana, as you're describing, going back is valuable to you, not only because of emotional affect, but also because of artistic production, just all of the things intertwined, and your own, I'm sure, necessity to see for yourself in the ways that you are moving through the world now. I would love to know more about the negotiations that each of you have had to make as you are recognizing the past as valuable. Like I can only imagine for you, Tommy, having to have that conversation with your mother of wanting to use her as subject in your photographs as well. Can you each talk about the negotiations that you've had to make with a previous generation who has a different value system than you do?
Yeah, my mom was just like, really? Like, this is what you do for, like, photography? It's like, all right. I'm more tickled by how game she's always down for it, but she doesn't really. I like this interest that a lot of my family has with photography and art, because it's just this thing you put on the wall. It's like, what? And this is like a whole career? It's like, yeah. But I like what it does for people. It is for them, like, they get out their phones or their cameras and they mark that occasion. And our attitudes are so different. So I want to learn, like, why did they keep this picture in particular still? And so I hope that there's some kind of reciprocal nature that happens with it. I don't want to go into it because I feel like we'll be here all day. But I feel like there's a lot of reciprocal characteristics that my family does. Like, they replant the herbs that's left over from takeout, and that's their garden, right? And this collage of cutting up my own pictures to reform new pictures I feel like comes from that, and what I feel like I learned. So. Sorry.
I think I'm, given that my last two projects were about my parents as well, I know that they wish I would stop. My hope is for the third one is to reunite them, because they haven't seen each other in 30 years. Wow. So I think it's been really interesting just processing as an artist, but also as a daughter, and now as a woman, your mom's story, and putting yourself in your mom's shoes, and then in a way doing the same thing with your dad, and just even thinking about a love story in general and how many different directions it goes once it ends. And it just feels like such a privilege to be in the middle of it, almost like a burden when you're a kid, because you're living out your parents' anger, their truth, their fallout, and now today you're almost you're directing it, you're in a position of creating art around it. And that's really emotional, but also such a privilege, because I guess for me it's been a way of reliving things and reliving memories, and also having more time with both of them.
That's beautiful.
I feel like I relate so much to what you both are saying in terms of, I think that my family would like for me to not photograph them sometimes, and but I think, like, for me, it's I think in the beginning, like, when I first, like, it was kind of like, okay, Keisha's taking pictures. Keisha's not just taking pictures. Keisha's a photographer. And they're like, what are you doing with these pictures? Like, who are you showing these pictures to? Which is something that I have to be very cognizant of, is like, like, I'm photographing them, and where is this going to be, and how are they, so I feel like that's the negotiation, is like their choices and their presence in the photograph. And their being, and you know what I mean, and what am I saying, or what is happening, or how is that being shown? But I think at the same time, like, it's such an important process to photograph and to document as much as possible. I think, and as I said earlier, like, especially when there are no images, like there's, at a certain point, like there's nothing. And so it's so important for me, and I'm so adamant about making sure that something is documented. Now, I'm no longer the photographer, because my family all has phones, they can do it, and they are doing it. But, I think that it's become important for me, and I think at a certain point now, like when I'm with them, they just know, like they're just used to the camera being there. But they are highly, highly aware of like, where is this picture going to be shown?
What you just said made me think of, both because of survival and maybe by choice, the ways that previous generations haven't continued or cared for a personal familial archive. Maybe it's partly a desire to not want to be seen, or a desire to, or again, a value system that being seen in that material is not necessarily of importance because other things are important, or of significance because why am I preserving this object in this material? But what I find in each of your practices is the necessity for preservation in both image and landscape and object, but also in the coalescing of all of that within your practices. And so before we open up for audience questions, I would love if each of you could share maybe a project that you're working on, or something that you would love for us to support you within, an exhibition that you have on view, just anything that you'd like to share with each of us.
Y'all first. I'm good.
Well, I got a show up right now, y'all. So I have a show up right now at Higher Pictures. Thank you.
CPW.
And
ICP.
And at CPW, and at ICP that I co-curated. So all are up through the beginning of May, so definitely if you have time, check them out.
The project Father is up at Foam. It opened a few months ago. It's closing at the end of May. It's going to Arles and then Berlin. And then I'm working on a new project about confessions.
Yeah. I have my first museum solo show. Opens at the Addison Gallery in Andover, Massachusetts, outside of Boston. Opens in September. Yeah. And that's all I got.
Well, thank each of you, and I just want to open up the floor for questions from our audience as well. We'll have a mic in this space.
I have a question for Keisha. You mentioned that your family often asks you, what will you do with these photos? How will they be used? Where will they be seen? And because it's your family you're photographing, it's also your story. But I'm wondering how you answer that question and how they accept that answer.
Hello. I tell them, like, I might use this in a book, or it's just sometimes honestly and truly, it is just for me. Or it may be an exhibition. Sometimes, like, I'm taking pictures of myself and they're like, what the hell are you doing? So sometimes that does happen, but I usually tell them, and there are images that I don't put out there. It's just for my family and it's just for us. Yeah.
Other questions?
Do you mind talking into the mic? Thank you.
It's your family, right? How did you decide that this is important for everybody? And it's so important that you became motivated to create a project and put it together. What was the inspiration for this?
It's for all of us.
All of you, why not?
Yeah. To be fair.
It doesn't have to be difficult. I think as a photographer, you're always interested in your family, right?
I don't know.
No, you don't think so?
Well, I was really ashamed of my family. You know, my dad was 70 plus years old. Well, and I was really not comfortable with my family. So I think I became a photographer to escape my story and to really run away to the furthest corners of the world and really focus on other people. And through that, I just started to understand how lost I was inside. And photography almost helped me confront these things that I was so embarrassed by growing up. So I think my impulse wasn't start looking at myself, it was look at everybody else. And this was going to be the language that I used.
Yeah.
I don't know if I thought it was so important, but it became almost a way of speaking about it, It's become my life. My art is my life.
Oh, it technically was my mom's idea. Yeah, I'm now kind of remembering the exact, between, was my first winter break from grad school, and it was really frustrating to figure out what I was exactly doing, not being in the South anymore. So she volunteered to be photographed, so Mom. But it was before, 5 years later, she gave me the album of her work that was like, oh, I did not know that she was a photographer before it. So it's almost like thinking back at that moment where she volunteered as like gifting me that idea, gifting me that that permission to be a photographer, to be this whatever I was doing. And yeah, that's the catalyst for photographing with my mom, my family. And I think I want to point out that at times it's not always been a very idealistic relationship. Like if you look at the gap years, it's like, yeah, we definitely fought. And that's why there are no pictures from that year. But I think that's a kind of true dynamic of our human connections between, it's not always a straightforward thing. Yeah.
I mean, sorry, can I just jump in?
Yeah, great.
I mean, I think as I'm listening to you both, like Diana, it took me a long time before I photographed my family. Like I was photographing strangers on the street. I was photographing everything except for. I think like the first family member I photographed was my mom. I think one of the first pictures I took of my mom, she was asleep. I think that I also agree, like it wasn't this thing where I was just like, oh, this is so important that the world needs to, it just was something that I really had like just laser eye focus on, was just obsessed with just doing it. And then it became, it became something more. But I do want to say that, like just even thinking about like my language in photography is so different from my family's understanding of it. You know what I mean? Like the way in which they're thinking about the language of photography and photography's purpose is different than mine. And not to say that one is better than the other. I'm actually really fascinated by how we think about photography differently, and the functionality that it holds for us, and the ways in which photography is holding both functions and serving both functions in a different way. Wanted to say that.
I just want to follow up on that, Keisha. Exactly what I was thinking is that, I mean, all of your backgrounds are so different, and you use photography as a tool to process them, and yet we're all relating to them because it is a universal understanding. And then I'm hearing you talk about yourselves as photographers, which becomes a reflection of your present identity. So there's so many circles here. I think it's really more a comment than a question, but picking apart the process, the tool, and the object, and how many lives they each have. Yeah.
I know, I'm so like, it's so stressful to look at it. I know everyone can hear me, but
Well, thank you all for being here. Oh, one more question.
Oh,
yeah.
that's hilarious.
This might be a little scattered because I just want to keep it going because it's been a really great presentation so far, and I really appreciate just all the work and all the words. But I feel like you've all spoken to this to an extent, but I'm interested in any additional words of advice you have for photographers and artists who are trying to really reconnect and reclaim their cultures through layers of disconnection, right? Whether that's being a first or second generation, you know, American in my case, or really having to deal with those, you know, how you said visual absences, Keisha, of no archival photos, no, you know, Ancestry.com account, you know, to speak of, no paper trail, right? What do you advise, or how do you recommend that, you know, visual artists can, try to just reclaim that and make it feel like home again?
I mean, one thing, like one of my first responses to that question is that I do want to just kind of emphasize that I think that there are many ways of archiving. There, you know, like as I'm even speaking about, oh, there's no images, there are other, you know what I mean? Like it doesn't necessarily equate to like nothingness, like there was other things. So I think for me personally, and I don't know if this is advice, but I think for me personally, like it started with the inquiry and it started with the conversation, and it started like the more conversations I have with my family, the more I learn. Like I'm learning things that I was not aware of for all of my 49 years, you know? So I think for me, it started with wanting to find out, wanting to know, and wanting to kind of build, even though I don't have photographs, like me creating images is a way of kind of creating and I remember you were using the word restructuring home. So there was just kind of like this. So for me, I think that it's so important to have the conversations. It's so important to engage. It's so important to understand that that the object, like the space, is its archive in itself. And so that for me, I feel like that's the place to begin.
Yeah. Yeah, I think every new picture is a chance to try to say everything and to understand that that there is a limitation to the photograph or the image itself, but I don't think we need to hit the notes and say everything all at once. That fragmentation can be used to our advantage because we're so used to that thematic motif in our lives. So yeah, I think it's that I think someone asked me a similar question about how do you bring in your identity. It's like it informs my interests, but it isn't everything. And there's other ways to validate and confirm our place. So don't put too much stress on it. Just enjoy and make.
That's a great
I think.
Well, thank you, Tommy, Keisha, Diana, for your conversation and for just the generosity of each of your practices and for your tone for this conversation. And thank you all for being here and the generosity of your questions as well.
Thank you, Jene. Thank you.